As Mel Brooks continued to look back on those years, he explained that the hardest part was realizing how slowly the situation changed. Because when trouble arrives all at once, people react quickly. But when it arrives in small pieces, spread across months and years, it quietly becomes part of everyday life. And Mel said that this was exactly what happened within Rob Reiner's household, where concern slowly replaced comfort and caution replaced openness. And yet, from the outside, nothing appeared broken, because success, money, and reputation can act like strong walls that hide what is happening inside. And Mel admitted that even he, someone who knew the family intimately, sometimes forgot that emotional danger does not always look dramatic, and that fear often disguises itself as patience, especially in parents who believe that love means staying no matter the cost. Mel recalled several conversations with Rob during this period, conversations that seemed casual at the time, but later felt heavy with meaning, where Rob would talk about responsibility in a tired voice, explaining how difficult it was to balance hope with reality, and how every decision felt like a test of his identity as a father. Because to Rob, giving up was not an option, and Mel understood this deeply, because both men came from a generation shaped by hardship, where survival meant holding on even when things became painful, and where abandoning family felt unthinkable. But Mel also began to see that Rob's loyalty had turned into something more dangerous, a belief that endurance alone could fix what needed boundaries. And Mel struggled with this realization because it challenged his own values, values that told him to support rather than confront, to comfort rather than challenge. Mel said that there were moments when Rob seemed afraid to admit how bad things felt, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because saying it out loud made it real. And once something becomes real, it demands action, and action brings consequences that cannot be undone. And Mel recognized this fear because he had felt it himself many times in life, the fear of opening a door that cannot be closed again. And so he listened instead of pushing, believing that being present was enough. But as time went on, he began to wonder whether presence without honesty was simply another form of distance. One memory stayed with Mel more than most, not because it involved shouting or drama, but because of how quiet it was. A simple afternoon where Rob sat across from him, barely touching his food, staring at nothing, and speaking in half-finished sentences. And Mel remembered feeling a sense of alarm that he could not fully explain, a feeling that something was breaking under the surface. And yet he still did not press, still did not ask the hardest questions, because he did not want to cross a line he was not sure he had the right to cross. And this uncertainty followed Mel long after that afternoon ended. As Mel reflected, he spoke about how families often confuse help with rescue, believing that stepping in repeatedly will eventually solve the problem, when in reality, it can sometimes remove the natural limits that force change. And Mel said that Rob believed deeply in second chances, third chances, endless chances, because he believed that cutting someone off meant abandoning them. And Mel understood this fear, because abandonment was something their generation associated with cruelty rather than protection. But Mel also admitted that there were moments when he sensed that Rob's efforts were no longer helping, but rather postponing an outcome no one wanted to face. And that realization filled Mel with quiet dread rather than clarity. He described how Rob would sometimes share stories that sounded less like hope and more like exhaustion. Stories about constant tension, about walking carefully around certain conversations, about trying to keep peace rather than build trust. And Mel listened, offering sympathy instead of direction, because direction felt like judgment, and judgment felt like betrayal. Yet later, Mel wondered whether honesty would have been kinder than silence, because silence allowed everyone to continue pretending that things were manageable when they were not. Mel also spoke about how money complicated everything, not because there was too little of it, but because its presence created the illusion of control, the belief that every problem could be softened, delayed, or reshaped through support. And Mel said that this belief was common in Hollywood, where resources often solve surface-level problems, but emotional wounds do not follow the same rules. And Rob, like many parents, believed that stability required constant giving, even when giving began to cost more than it healed. And Mel admitted that he rarely challenged this belief directly, because he himself had grown up believing that providing was one of the purest expressions of love. As time went on, Mel noticed that Rob began to carry guilt like a second skin, guilt for past decisions, guilt for perceived failures, guilt for not being able to protect everyone at once. And Mel recognized this guilt as something deeply human, because parents often believe they are responsible not just for their children's actions, but for their pain, their mistakes, and their unhappiness. And Mel said that Rob spoke often about pain, framing every problem as something that needed understanding rather than limits. And while empathy is powerful, Mel began to see how empathy without boundaries can slowly become self-destruction, a realization that left him feeling torn between compassion and fear. Mel remembered moments when he almost spoke more forcefully, moments when words sat at the edge of his mouth, ready to challenge Rob's choices. But he held back, worried that pushing too hard would break trust rather than strengthen it. And this hesitation followed him for years, because it represented the conflict between who he was and who the situation demanded him to be. And Mel admitted that he often chose the safer role, the role of listener rather than challenger, because safety felt kinder in the moment, even if it proved costly later. As Mel aged, these memories did not fade as he hoped they would, but instead grew sharper, because distance often clarifies what closeness hides. And looking back, Mel saw patterns he could not see at the time, patterns of avoidance, accommodation, and fear disguised as love. And this clarity did not bring peace, but a heavy sense of responsibility, because it forced him to accept that doing nothing is also a choice. And sometimes that choice carries consequences as real as any action. Mel explained that he did not believe anyone intended harm, and that this made the situation even more painful, because it showed how easily good intentions can lead people down dangerous paths when they are not balanced by firm limits. And Mel said that this realization changed how he thought about love itself, teaching him that love is not just about staying, but about knowing when staying becomes harmful. A lesson he wished he had learned earlier, but one that came too late to change the past. And as he shared these reflections, Mel made it clear that he was not seeking forgiveness or understanding, but simply honesty, because honesty, even when painful, was the only thing left that felt useful, and the only thing that gave meaning to his regret. Looking back, Mel Brooks admitted that the hardest truth he had to face was how ordinary all the moments that mattered had seemed at the time. Because life rarely gives warning in the form of a single dramatic event. Instead, it gives it in small, quiet shifts, like tension building under the surface, conversations left unfinished, signs that were noticed but not acted on. And Mel realized that this slow accumulation of small choices often determines outcomes as much as, or more than, any single moment of crisis. And this was the lesson he carried with him as he reflected on Rob Reiner and the family he had loved as his own. Because love without courage can become a trap, a habit, and even a burden, no matter how well-intentioned it is. And Mel said that in his long life, he had learned to recognize the difference between humor that heals and humor that hides, between kindness that uplifts and kindness that excuses, and between patience that allows growth and patience that allows harm. And recognizing these differences too late is a source of deep and quiet sorrow that stays with you in ways laughter cannot erase. Mel spoke about the way patterns repeat in families, how the next generation often inherits not just material wealth, but emotional habits, the ways people learn to avoid confrontation, the ways they internalize fear or guilt without naming it, and how these habits, invisible to outsiders, slowly shape behavior until even the most loving actions become tangled with unintended consequences. And he admitted that seeing this in Rob and those around him was painful, because it showed how fragile human systems are, how easily trust can be stretched beyond its limits, and how the very values that guide people toward love and compassion can sometimes blind them to the harm those same values allow. He recalled long nights of thinking about decisions that had to be made, and how no advice, no support, and no amount of generosity could guarantee safety or happiness, because life is not a script, and even the most carefully planned scene can unravel in ways no one predicted. And that lesson, he said, was something he had seen play out repeatedly, not just in Hollywood, but in families everywhere, and in himself, because he understood that wisdom is often measured less by what one does correctly than by how one responds to the mistakes one witnesses and participates in, sometimes unknowingly, over decades. Mel reflected on the concept of regret, how it is both personal and shared, a mirror of love and responsibility, and how it can teach humility if it is recognized and accepted rather than denied. And he described evenings when he would sit quietly in his home, thinking not about the laughter he had given the world, but about the moments he had failed to intervene when intervention might have mattered, and how those quiet reflections were heavier than any applause, because they were real, and they carried the weight of consequences that were slow to appear, but undeniable when he looked back. In speaking about Rob Reiner and his family, Mel did not assign blame, because assigning blame implies intent and malice, and there was none. What he described was a story of human beings doing their best under pressure, guided by love, but constrained by fear, exhaustion, and tradition. And in recounting these memories, Mel highlighted a larger lesson about life itself, about how people navigate moral and emotional choices, how courage often requires saying difficult things, how love sometimes demands limits, and how silence, while comfortable in the moment, can become a burden that lasts decades. Mel also discussed the challenge of reconciling public image with private life, how the world sees success and happiness in fame and wealth, while the reality behind closed doors is far more complex, and how this contrast can create isolation, misunderstanding, and even guilt, because the outside observer cannot feel the small daily tensions, the worries kept secret, or the exhaustion that comes from managing relationships without sufficient support. And Mel emphasized that acknowledging this complexity is essential to understanding human behavior in any family or social context, famous or not. As he spoke, Mel described his hope that sharing these reflections might help others recognize the importance of noticing patterns, of asking difficult questions, of balancing compassion with boundaries, and of understanding that even the most loving intentions can have unintended consequences if they are not tempered by courage and honesty. And he encouraged people to remember that human relationships are rarely simple, that love does not automatically solve problems, and that sometimes doing the hard thing, the uncomfortable, challenging thing, is the truest act of care. Finally, Mel Brooks spoke about the lasting effect of these experiences on his own life, how they shaped his understanding of responsibility, morality, and empathy, and how, at the end of decades filled with laughter and creation, he had learned that the greatest wisdom comes from reflection on what one could have done differently, not as a source of guilt, but as a guide for living more attentively, more kindly, and with greater awareness of the consequences of one's choices. And as he concluded his reflections, he did so not with anger, blame, or recrimination, but with the quiet hope that others might see these lessons and apply them to their own lives, because the ultimate goal of love and attention is not perfection, but awareness, courage, and a willingness to act thoughtfully even when the outcomes are uncertain. And that is the story Mel Brooks wanted to leave behind. A story not of failure or judgment, but of human complexity, responsibility, and the enduring power of reflection. Lessons that anyone can take to heart, regardless of fame, fortune, or circumstance. And that in the end, the measure of a life is not just what we create for others, but also how deeply we learn to understand ourselves and the people we love.